The neon glow of Times Square reflected off the wet pavement as DeAndre Lewis walked down 7th Avenue, his camera bag slung over his shoulder. The city never slept, but tonight it felt different. The air was heavy, like a storm brewing just beneath the surface. He had spent the past 5 years building his name as one of New York's top photojournalists, his work gracing the covers of magazines, newspapers, and online platforms that claimed to tell the truth. But truth, he had learned, was a negotiable currency in a world that still viewed black men with cameras as threats instead of storytellers. It had started with a simple Asimenta protest in Harlem. Nothing new, nothing unusual. But when DeAndre arrived camera in hand, he saw it wasn't just any protest. This was a march for Darius Grant, a 17-year-old black boy who had been killed by police just days before. Another name, another life, lost to a system that refused to see black skin as something worth protecting. The march moved through the streets like a heartbeat, voices raised in anger, in grief, in a demand for something that had never truly been given. DeAndre captured everything, the mother clutching her son's photo, the father staring into the distance with hollow eyes, the young kids raising their fists in the air, refusing to be silent. And then the shift came. He heard it before he saw it. Sirens. Orders barked through megaphones. The shift from peace to chaos in the span of a heartbeat. The police closed in, shields up, batons drawn. The first canister of tear gas hit the pavement, and the street exploded into a blur of running bodies, screams, and smoke curling through the air like a ghost. DeAndre kept his camera steady, moving through the chaos, capturing the truth no one wanted to see. Until they saw him, until the officers noticed him, a black man, in the middle of a protest, holding a camera. That was all it took. Before he could react, he was slammed to the ground, his camera ripped from his hands. The impact stole the breath from his lungs, gravel cutting into his skin as a knee pressed into his back. "I'm Press," he gasped. "I'm Press!" But the only response was a fist gripping his collar, dragging him up, his feet barely touching the ground. "What are you really doing out here?" one of the officers sneered. Documenting the truth, DeAndre shot back. The next hit came fast. A punch to the stomach, sharp and unforgiving. He doubled over, breath stolen, before being thrown to the pavement again. They didn't care that he was a journalist. They didn't care that his press pass was hanging from his neck. To them, he was just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. And for that, he had to pay. The next morning, DeAndre woke up in a holding cell, his ribs aching, his wrists swollen. His camera was gone. His press pass, nowhere to be found. He had been charged with resisting arrest, a charge that would never stick but would still stain his record like an ink spill that refused to fade. He knew how this worked. They wanted to scare him. They wanted to remind him that his lens could capture the truth, but it couldn't change the rules of the game. But what they didn't know was that DeAndre had never been the kind of man to back down. He left the station with bruises, but no fear. Instead of going home, he went straight to his editor's office at the Manhattan Post, dropping the story on her desk. "I have footage," he said, voice raw but steady. "You want a real story? Here it is." She hesitated. "DeAndre, you know how this works. We have to be careful." He laughed, shaking his head. "Careful? The cops weren't careful when they slammed me into the pavement last night. They weren't careful when they killed Darius Grant." She exhaled. "This could cost you your career." DeAndre held her gaze. "If I don't tell the truth, then what's the point of having a career at all?" A long silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Run it." The article hit the front page the next day. Photojournalist beaten. Arrested while covering protest. DeAndre's photos were there, raw and unfiltered. The blood on the pavement. The terror in the protesters' eyes. The police officer with his baton raised, mid-swing. It was undeniable. And the city? The city exploded. The NYPD tried to discredit him, tried to say he was interfering. But DeAndre had the footage, the receipts, the truth. And the people? They believed him. Protests grew bigger. The names of the lost were chanted louder. And suddenly, the system that had tried to silence him was now being forced to listen. But DeAndre wasn't done. Because this wasn't just about one night. This was about every journalist who had ever been silenced. Every black storyteller who had been erased. Every truth that had been buried under lies and reports that told only the version of history people wanted to hear. So he took his story and kept going. Toured the country, speaking about the weaponization of the police against the press. Truth Uncensored. And when he was invited to speak at Columbia University about press freedom and racial bias in reporting, he looked out at the crowd and knew they had tried to break him. They had tried to erase him, but all they had done was turn him into something unstoppable. And as he stood there, camera slung over his shoulder, voice steady and unshaken, he realized they could come for him again. They could hit him, arrest him, try to silence him, but they could never change what he had already done. The truth was out there, and no matter how hard they tried, they could never take it back. The Los Angeles sun beat down on the streets, the air thick with the scent of smog and ambition. DeAndre Lewis sat on the balcony of a small cafe in downtown LA, sipping his coffee, his camera resting on the table beside him. It had been 2 years since he had been beaten, arrested, and nearly erased for telling the truth. But instead of breaking him, they had made him bigger than ever. His photography series, The Truth Uncensored, had become a movement. His work had been featured in Time magazine, The Washington Post, and The Guardian. He had spoken at universities, press conferences, and even the United Nations about press freedom and the criminalization of black journalists. But with visibility came enemies. And DeAndre had learned that the more truth you expose, the more powerful the forces trying to silence you become. He had come to LA to cover a different kind of story. The city was preparing to tear down a historic black neighborhood, Jefferson Heights, an area that had been home to black families for generations. The city called it progress, called it a revitalization project, but DeAndre had heard this story before. Gentrification disguised as improvement. Wealthy investors erasing the people who built the city. And he knew that if he didn't document it, no one else would. It started with a meeting in a small community center. DeAndre sat in the back, camera rolling, as black residents, business owners, and elders gathered to fight back against the project. "They say they're building affordable housing," said Miss Betty, a 72-year-old woman who had lived in Jefferson Heights her entire life. "But what they really mean is they're building for rich white folks who don't want us here." Heads nodded. "First, They close our grocery stores, another man said. Then the rent goes up. Now they're coming for our houses. What's left for us? DeAndre captured everything. The anger, the fear, the determination. This wasn't just about buildings. It was about erasure. And the people in power, they knew exactly what they were doing. The next morning, DeAndre walked through Jefferson Heights, camera in hand. He photographed boarded-up homes, businesses marked for demolition, and residents packing up their lives in moving trucks, forced out by rising rents. He knocked on doors, listened to stories of families who had been in the neighborhood for decades but were being pushed out overnight. And then he found the construction site. A massive high-rise was already being built, not for the people who had lived here, but for the wealthy newcomers who wanted the culture without the people who created it. DeAndre took his camera and started filming. And then the security guards showed up. They came fast, 3 of them, white, wearing sunglasses and bulletproof vests like they were cops. "You can't be here," one of them said. DeAndre didn't stop filming. "I'm press." "Not here, you're not." A hand reached for his camera. DeAndre stepped back. "I have the right to document public spaces." "You think the law's gonna protect you?" The words were quiet but heavy, and DeAndre knew. They weren't threatening to arrest him. They were threatening something worse. He turned to leave, heart pounding. And as he walked away, he realized this wasn't just a fight about gentrification. This was a war over who was allowed to exist. And the people in power, they were ready to play dirty. That night, DeAndre was editing footage in his hotel room when his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Leave it alone." A moment later, another text. A photo of his hotel. DeAndre's stomach dropped. They were watching him. They knew where he was, and they wanted him to disappear. But DeAndre had survived New York, and he wasn't about to back down now. The next morning, he met with a group of black activists in the city. "You're being watched." One of them, Malik said. "I know," DeAndre admitted. Malik nodded. "They've done this before. Intimidate people, silence the ones who make too much noise." A local organizer. DeAndre pulled out his laptop. "Then let's make sure the world sees this before they try to bury it." That night, DeAndre dropped the footage online, exposed the corruption, showed the text messages, the security guards, the families being pushed out, and within hours, it went viral. The news picked it up. Protesters hit the streets. People demanded answers. And suddenly, the developers who thought they could operate in silence were being forced into the spotlight. But the fight wasn't over. Because 3 nights later, DeAndre was walking back to his rental car when he noticed something. A black SUV, idling at the corner. The second he stepped off the curb, the tires screeched. DeAndre jumped back as the SUV sped toward him. He barely dodged it. The car raced past, then disappeared into the night. His hands shook because he knew what that was. A warning, a message. Next time, you won't be so lucky. The next day, DeAndre went back to Malik and Imani. "They just tried to kill me," he said, his voice steady. Malik exhaled. "You ready to go public?" DeAndre nodded. "Then let's do it." The next morning, DeAndre was sitting in front of a national news camera, telling the world exactly what had happened. He named the developers, named the companies, exposed the intimidation, the threats, the attempted attack, and the moment it aired, everything changed. The city was forced to investigate. The developers were put under pressure, and Jefferson Heights, it was saved. But DeAndre, he knew this wasn't the end, because there would always be another neighborhood at risk, another system trying to erase black people, another truth they didn't want exposed. But if they thought they could scare him into silence, they had learned nothing at all. Because as long as DeAndre Lewis had a camera, a voice, and a story to tell, they would never be able to erase him. The sun burned hot over the Arizona desert, turning the horizon into a shimmering mirage. The roads stretched long and empty, the occasional rusting skeleton of an old truck marking where someone had given up and left the desert to claim what was left. Dani Alvarez had spent her whole life in Sandstone, a small, sun-bleached town that most people only pass through on their way to somewhere else. The town wasn't big enough for a mall, not important enough for tourists, but it was old enough to have its share of ghosts. The kind no one talked about. Her mother used to warn her, "Sandstone has a long memory, Mija. Careful where you stand." Dani had never really understood what that meant until now. She was 17 when she got her first job at the Fill Up Diner, a dusty little roadside spot that had been in business for as long as anyone could remember. Truckers stopped there on their way to Phoenix. Old men sat at the counter drinking coffee they never seemed to finish, and locals came when they didn't feel like cooking. She worked the afternoon shifts, cleaning tables, pouring coffee, listening to people talk about everything except the things that mattered. It was an easy job until the day she made a mistake. She served the wrong people. The man had walked in just after sundown, his clothes coated in desert dust, his boots worn from too many miles. He wasn't from Sandstone, that much was clear. Dani had seen the way newcomers were treated here. The hesitation, the sideways glances. But this wasn't just a newcomer, he was Navajo. She didn't think twice about serving him. She took his order, brought him a cold glass of water, and left him to eat in peace. It wasn't until she heard the heavy footsteps behind her that she realized her mistake. She turned. 3 men stood near the counter. She knew all of them. Mr. Calloway, the owner of the hardware store, Sheriff Dean Walker, and Jake Miller, the son of the wealthiest man in Sandstone. Jake was the first to speak. "You served him?" Dani frowned. "Yeah, that's my job." Calloway shook his head. Not to him. Dani felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. She looked over her shoulder. The man had stopped eating. His shoulders were tense, his hands resting too still on the table. He knew. He had probably known the second he walked in. Sheriff Walker stepped closer. "You need to tell him to leave, Dani." She gripped the tray in her hands. "He hasn't done anything." Jake let out a low chuckle. "That ain't the point." Dani's heart pounded. Every part of her told her to back down, to apologize, to pretend she hadn't seen the hate in their eyes. But her mother's words echoed in her head. "Careful where you stand." She turned toward the man. "You don't have to go." The 3 men tensed. For a moment, everything hung in the air waiting. Then Sheriff Walker exhaled through his nose. "Suit yourself." They left. Dani's hands shook as she cleared the table next to the man's. He watched her, his dark eyes unreadable. "You shouldn't have done that," he said quietly. Dani forced a smile. "I know." And she also knew this wasn't over. The next morning, the message was waiting for her. spray painted in thick black letters on the diner's back wall. Leave Sandstone. Her stomach twisted. By noon, the whole town knew. Her boss fired her before she could even take off her apron. I can't have trouble here, he muttered. By evening, someone had thrown a brick through her bedroom window. Danny's mother grabbed her shoulders. Mija, we need to leave. But Danny had spent her whole life watching people like Jake Miller get their way. She wasn't going to run. She went to the sheriff's office the next day. Sheriff Walker leaned back in his chair, his boots resting lazily on his desk. You want me to do what? Donnie swallowed hard. Find out who vandalized the diner. The sheriff smiled. That'd be a waste of time. She felt her hands clench into fists. So that's it? You're just gonna let them do this? Walker shrugged. You knew what would happen. Dani stared at him. For the first time, she really saw him. Saw the way his badge didn't mean justice. It meant control. It meant power. And it meant that people like her didn't matter. She turned on her heel and walked out. This fight wasn't going to be won in a sheriff's office. She needed something bigger. She spent the next 2 days gathering names. People who'd been pushed out of jobs. People whose homes had been defaced. People who had lost something to men like Jake Miller. By the end of the week, she had 37 names. And then she did something Sandstone had never seen before. She called a town meeting. They met at the old church, a place where voices echoed loud enough to be heard. At first, people hesitated. Then Dani stood, holding up the list of names. This town was built on our backs, she said, but it doesn't belong to us. Not yet. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Her mother sat in the front row, her hands clasped tight in her lap. The sun burned hot over the Arizona desert, turning the horizon into a shimmering mirage. The road stretched long and empty, the occasional rusting skeleton of an old truck marking where someone had given up and left the desert to claim what was left. Dani Alvarez had spent her whole life in Sandstone, a small, sun-bleached town that most people only passed through on their way to somewhere else. The town wasn't big enough for a mall, not important enough for tourists, but it was old enough to have its share of ghosts. The kind no one talked about. Her mother used to warn her, Sandstone has a long memory, Mija. Careful where you stand. Dani had never really understood what that meant until now. She was 17 when she got her first job at the Fill Up Diner, a dusty little roadside spot that had been in business for as long as anyone could remember. Truckers stopped there on their way to Phoenix. Old men sat at the counter drinking coffee they never seemed to finish, and locals came when they didn't feel like cooking. She worked the afternoon shifts, cleaning tables, pouring coffee, listening to people talk about everything except the things that mattered. It was an easy job until the day she made a mistake. She served the wrong people. The man had walked in just after sundown, his clothes coated in desert dust, his boots worn from too many miles. He wasn't from Sandstone, that much was clear. Dani had seen the way newcomers were treated here. The hesitation, the sideways glances. But this wasn't just a newcomer, he was Navajo. She didn't think twice about serving him. She took his order, brought him a cold glass of water, and left him to eat in peace. It wasn't until she heard the heavy footsteps behind her that she realized her mistake. She turned. 3 men stood near the counter. She knew all of them. Mr. Calloway, the owner of the hardware store, Sheriff Dean Walker, and Jake Miller, the son of the wealthiest man in Sandstone. Jake was the first to speak. You served him? Dani frowned. Yeah, that's my job. Calloway shook his head. Not to him. Danny felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. She looked over her shoulder. The man had stopped eating. His shoulders were tense, his hands resting too still on the table. He knew. He had probably known the second he walked in. Sheriff Walker stepped closer. You need to tell him to leave, Donnie. She gripped the tray in her hands. He hasn't done anything. Jake let out a low chuckle. That ain't the point. Donnie's heart pounded. Every part of her told her to back down, to apologize, to pretend she hadn't seen the hate in their eyes. But her mother's words echoed in her head. Careful where you stand. She turned toward the man. You don't have to go. The three men tensed. For a moment, everything hung in the air waiting. Then Sheriff Walker exhaled through his nose. Suit yourself. They left. Donnie's hands shook as she cleared the table next to the man's. He watched her. His dark eyes unreadable. You shouldn't have done that, he said quietly. Danny forced a smile. I know. And she also knew this wasn't over. The next morning, the message was waiting for her. Spray painted in thick black letters on the diner's back wall. Leave Sandstone. Her stomach twisted. By noon, the whole town knew. Her boss fired her before she could even take off her apron. I can't have trouble here, he muttered. By evening, someone had thrown a brick through her bedroom window. Danny's mother grabbed her shoulders. Mija, we need to leave. But Danny had spent her whole life watching people like Jake Miller get their way. She wasn't going to run. She went to the sheriff's office the next day. Sheriff Walker leaned back in his chair, his boots resting lazily on his desk. You want me to do what? Donnie swallowed hard. Find out who vandalized the diner. The sheriff smiled. That'd be a waste of time. She felt her hands clench into fists. So that's it? You're just gonna let them do this? Walker shrugged. You knew what would happen. Danny stared at him. For the first time, she really saw him. Saw the way his badge didn't mean justice. It meant control. It meant power. And it meant that people like her didn't matter. She turned on her heel and walked out. This fight wasn't going to be won in a sheriff's office. She needed something bigger. She spent the next 2 days gathering names. People who'd been pushed out of jobs. People whose homes had been defaced. People who had lost something to men like Jake Miller. By the end of the week, she had 37 names. And then she did something Sandstone had never seen before. She called a town meeting. They met at the old church, a place where voices echoed loud enough to be heard. At first, people hesitated. Then Donnie stood, holding up the list of names. This town was built on our backs, she said, but it doesn't belong to us. Not yet. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Her mother sat in the front row, her hands clasped tight in her lap. Neither was anyone who had helped burn the diner down, because now the world was watching, and Sandstone wasn't their secret anymore. 6 months later, the fill-up diner was rebuilt, but not by them, by her, by the people who had stood with her, by the people who had learned that fear was a choice. Donnie stood outside the diner's new sign. It wasn't the same as before. It was bigger, brighter, and for the first time in Sandstone's long, sun-bleached history, it was theirs. The streets of Charleston, South Carolina were old. Not just in the way of cracked cobblestones and preserved plantations, but in the way that history clung to them like damp air. The kind of history that was whispered in classrooms but never truly spoken aloud. The kind of history that made a black man walking in the wrong neighborhood a suspect before he was even a person. And for Malcolm Reed, history had just come crashing into his future. He had grown up in Gadsden Green, a part of Charleston the tourists didn't see, where the streets told stories, where kids played in yards their families had owned for generations, only to see those same homes snatched away by developers who called it revitalization. Malcolm's father used to tell him, "They don't take from you all at once. They take in inches, in taxes, in rules you didn't know existed." But Malcolm had plans. College, law school. Then he was going to come back and fight for his neighborhood. Make sure the people who built Charleston weren't erased from it. But Charleston had other plans. It started with his grandfather's house. A white lawyer showed up one afternoon, papers in hand, talking about zoning changes, tax increases, laws that had been passed quietly, behind closed doors. The house Malcolm's family had owned for 50 years, gone. Bought up for a hotel expansion. His grandfather sat in silence, hands folded on the kitchen table, as the lawyer explained how little their fight would matter. Malcolm clenched his fists, because this wasn't just about a house. This was about a war Charleston had been waging for centuries, and Malcolm was done playing by their rules. That night, he started digging public records, tax documents, every loophole the city had used to push black families out of their homes. And what he found, it was bigger than his grandfather's house. It was a pattern, a strategy, a quiet, systematic erasure of black Charleston. They weren't just taking homes, they were rewriting history. The protests started small, a handful of people standing outside City Hall, holding signs with names: the Gadsden family, the Jenkins family, the Browns. Names that had once been painted on street signs, now erased to make room for luxury condos. But then the crowds grew, because everyone in Charleston had a story. Everyone had lost something. And for the first time in decades, people were paying attention. Then the city made its move. A curfew, a public statement from the mayor calling the protests disruptive. And then the arrests. Malcolm was one of the first, taken in the middle of the night, not by uniformed cops, but by men in suits. No badge numbers, no explanations, just a cold voice telling him time to go. And then he was in the back of an unmarked car, speeding through the city he had fought to protect. They didn't take him to the police station. They took him to a private office, one that overlooked the Charleston waterfront, where white men had once auctioned off his ancestors like cattle. And across from him sat Judge Samuel Whitmore, a man whose family had owned Charleston long before Malcolm's family had ever been free. Whitmore smiled. "You've made quite the mess, son." Malcolm didn't speak. Whitmore leaned back. "You think these protests are going to change something? You think Charleston belongs to you?" He laughed. "Charleston belongs to people who know how to keep it running." His eyes darkened. "And you? You're a problem?" Malcolm's jaw tightened. "What do you want?" Whitmore slid a folder across the desk. Inside were papers, a job offer, a salary higher than Malcolm had ever seen, a promise that if he walked away, he could have a future. Malcolm exhaled. "You think you can buy me?" Whitmore just smiled. "Everyone has a price, son. Malcolm stared at the folder, then at Whitmore, and then he picked up the papers. Whitmore's smile widened, but Malcolm wasn't done, because instead of signing, he ripped the papers in half and watched the smile vanish. "Keep your money," Malcolm said. Then he stood and walked out. The next day, his name was all over the news, but not as a leader. As a criminal, Charleston PD held a press conference, said Malcolm was under investigation for fraud, for inciting violence, for stealing city property. All lies. But Malcolm knew the truth didn't matter, because Charleston didn't like when black men fought back. They thought they could scare him, thought he'd disappear under the weight of a fabricated case. But they had forgotten Malcolm had studied the law, and now he was going to use it against them. The lawsuit hit 2 weeks later. Malcolm Reed versus the city of Charleston. The accusations? Decades of discriminatory housing practices, illegal zoning laws, fraud. And when the case made national headlines, the city panicked, because Malcolm wasn't just fighting for his grandfather's house anymore. He was fighting for every family Charleston had ever tried to erase. The trial lasted months. Every day, Malcolm walked into that courtroom with evidence, with testimonies, with names of people who had been forced out of their homes, pushed into poverty, abandoned by a city that claimed to honor its history while destroying the people who built it. The defense tried to bury him, tried to break him, tried to make him fold. But Malcolm didn't break, didn't fold, didn't stop. And when the verdict came, it shook Charleston to its core. The city was found guilty, ordered to pay millions in reparations, forced to return stolen homes to the families they had taken them from. And Judge Samuel Whitmore resigned in disgrace. But Malcolm wasn't done, because Charleston was still bleeding, and now he had the power to stop it. A year later, Malcolm Reed was elected mayor. The first black mayor in Charleston's 350-year history. He stood on the steps of City Hall, looking over a city that had tried to break him, and he made a promise that the next time Charleston wrote its history, black voices wouldn't just be footnotes. They would be the ones holding the pen. The Charleston heat had a way of settling in your bones, of pressing against your skin like a warning that the past never really left. For Malcolm Reed, the city had been a battlefield since the day he was born. Now, it was his to protect. A year had passed since he had stood on the steps of City Hall, sworn in as the first black mayor of Charleston. A victory that had felt impossible. A victory that had cost him everything. Because Charleston wasn't just a city. It was a system. And systems never gave up power without a fight. It started with the police. The department had never wanted him there. Never wanted to answer to a black man. To a man who had spent his entire life calling them out. So when Malcolm pushed for new reforms, body cameras, independent investigations, an end to racist policing, they pushed back. The union resisted. The police chief resigned. And in the vacuum left behind, something worse took its place. It started in North Charleston. A shooting. A black teenager, 15 years old, unarmed, killed by an officer in broad daylight. The story was all too familiar. But this time, the officer didn't face any charges, because this time, the shooting wasn't caught on camera. Malcolm sat in his office, staring at the crime report. Something was wrong. The evidence didn't add up. The witnesses had been silenced. And the officer, a man named Daniel Grayson, had a record. Multiple complaints, multiple incidents. And yet, he had never faced consequences because he had friends in the right places. Friends who had survived Malcolm's lawsuit. Friends who were waiting for the right moment to take their city back. The first warning came a week later. Malcolm had just finished a press conference when his security detail pulled him aside. "There's a threat," one of them murmured. A letter slipped under the door of his mother's house. 3 words, scrawled in thick black ink. "Time is up." Malcolm had seen threats before, had received them since the day he started speaking out. But this was different, because this wasn't just about Malcolm. This was about sending a message, not just to him, but to every black family still standing in Charleston. Then came the explosion. It happened at Gadsden Green, the neighborhood Malcolm had grown up in. A fire. A church burned to the ground. The oldest black church in Charleston. A place where his ancestors had once prayed in secret, in a time when prayer itself was rebellion. Now it was ash. And the police? They called it an accident. Malcolm knew better. Because this wasn't just a fire, this was a declaration of war. The investigation was a sham. No suspects, no arrests, just silence. But Malcolm wasn't going to let this slide. So he did what they feared most. He dug deeper. His sources led him to a name. The Palmetto Guard. A militia. Not just a group of racists in the woods. These men were organized. Former cops. Former soldiers. Men who had been waiting for someone like Malcolm to rise up so they could crush him. And their leader? Daniel Grayson. The same cop who had shot that black teenager. The same cop Malcolm had tried to expose. And now, he had declared war. The next morning, Malcolm called a meeting. His team, his lawyers, his security. "We go public," one of his advisors said. "We call in the FBI." Malcolm shook his head. Because the FBI had been in Charleston for years. They had never stopped the Klan, never stopped the lynchings, never stopped the system from swallowing people like him whole. They weren't coming to save him. No one was. So Malcolm made a choice. They weren't going to fight this battle in the courts. They were going to fight it in the streets. The next protest was the biggest Charleston had ever seen. Not just the black community, but everyone who had lost something to this city's corruption. People who had been displaced. People who had been silenced. And this time, they weren't just marching. They were demanding action. That night, the police attacked. Tear gas, rubber bullets, arrests. It was a riot before it even began. And in the chaos, someone shot Malcolm. A bullet tore through his shoulder, knocking him to the pavement. Blood soaked his shirt. His vision blurred. And as he lay there, staring up at the Charleston skyline, he wondered if this was how it was always meant to end. He woke up in a hospital. His mother was crying. The news was everywhere. Charleston's first black mayor shot at protest. The Palmetto Guard denied involvement. The police called it an isolated incident. And yet, no one was arrested. No one was charged. And Malcolm realized this wasn't just about killing him. It was about sending a message. to anyone who dared to fight back. But Malcolm had his own message. The day he left the hospital, he went back to City Hall, his arm still in a sling, his body still aching, and he signed an executive order, disbanding Charleston's entire police force, firing every corrupt officer, kicking out the men who had let this city rot for generations, and in their place, a new force, trained differently, run differently, and the first black police chief in Charleston's history. The Palmetto Guard tried to retaliate, tried to fight back, but now the city was against them. And when the FBI finally did step in, they weren't investigating Malcolm. They were investigating Daniel Grayson for domestic terrorism, for murder, for the fire. And when they finally arrested him, Malcolm stood outside the courthouse, watching as the man who had once called himself a protector was dragged away in cuffs. A reminder that history doesn't just erase people, sometimes it repeats itself. A year later, Malcolm sat in his office, staring at a city that had tried to kill him, a city that had broken him, and yet a city he still believed in, because change didn't happen overnight, didn't happen in one election, didn't happen without blood, without loss, without sacrifice. But this time, Charleston's history wouldn't be written by the men who had built their power on the backs of others. This time, it would be written by the people who refused to be erased. And Malcolm Reed wasn't done fighting yet.